I'm John McKee, editor of Messianic Apologetics, messianicapologetics.net. And I would like to welcome you to this episode of Messianic Insider, your theology and news roundup for November the 18th, 2025. Today on our theology roundup, we are continuing with a short two-parter. Actually, it's a long two-parter, but we started yesterday on 1 Corinthians 7:17 through 24 on Paul's rule. And if you have not already, I do encourage you to go back to yesterday's live stream, watch or listen to the presentation, because we're going to be picking up with 1 Corinthians 7:21. Now, if you will turn with me to the Messianic Apologetics website, messianicapologetics.net, click on the FAQs tab. This shows all of the frequently asked questions entries we've got going back to the year 2000 to 2018, all the way back to the old TNN Online or Theology News Network website. We transitioned to Messianic Apologetics in 2015. That was 10 years ago. All of these are listed in alphabetical order, so scroll down to the letter C. 1 Corinthians 7:17 through 24. Click that, and then a PDF file will open. And here we are at 1 Corinthians 7:21, where we stopped yesterday. And today's discussion will be shorter than yesterday's. But to just briefly review, what is Paul's rule in all the assemblies? Is it remain in your station, i.e., you have been assigned a permanent spiritual, social vocation which can never change at all? Or is it instead abide in the calling to which you were called, meaning a calling to salvation and sanctification? And while your calling into salvation does happen at a particular station in life or a particular vocation, your ultimate loyalty is to that calling to salvation and sanctification, being brought into Messiah faith, abiding in the Lord. And if there are any changes or alterations to be made, they come as a result of growing in Him, abiding in Him, and He directs such changes. So 1 Corinthians 7:17 through 24, it gets thrown around a lot in bilateral ecclesiology sectors of Messianic Judaism. Those on the one law, one Torah side, Hebrew root side, often ignore this passage. They don't address it at all. Even with the growing quote-unquote scholarship being witnessed in a lot of the pro-Namian sector, you don't see this being discussed that much, or for that same matter, Galatians 5:2-3. But Messianic Apologetics, I have been addressing these passages for well over 10 years. So my point of view is, of course, my own. It's textually rooted. Yes, Jewish people stay Jewish, non-Jewish people stay non-Jewish. Jewish people, as Paul said, were not to practice episposm, remove the marks of circumcision, and hence find themselves committing apostasy and assimilating into Greco-Roman paganism. Non-Jewish people in this passage, they did not have to go through circumcision as a result of their being called into Messiah faith. Being called into Messiah faith is something which comes about by the sheer grace of God. So we're going to review some of these points, of course, at the end as we summarize what we've gone through yesterday and now today. All right. 1 Corinthians 7:17 through 23. Were you called being a bondservant? Don't let that bother you. But if you get an opportunity to become free, use it. For he who was called in the Lord, being a bondservant, is the Lord's free man. Likewise, he who was called being free is Messiah's bondservant. You were bought with a price. Don't become bondservants of men. World Messianic Bible. 1 Corinthians 7, 21 through 23. In the midst of the discussion pertaining to Paul's rule in all the assemblies in 1 Corinthians 7, 17 through 24, was an example of what was to be done regarding ancient slaves. Paul inquired, "Were you called as a slave? Don't let that bother you. But if indeed you can become free, make the most of the opportunity." 1 Corinthians 7:21, Tree of Life version. Some might be prone to take the being called, represented by the aorist passive, divine passive, eklethes, as a social/spiritual vocation. And there are those in history who have not only taken slavery as a social/spiritual vocation, but who have errantly argued that it was a status which few could leave, and that the institution of slavery should not/never be abolished. This should be immediately disregarded because Paul asserted, excuse me, if you are able to become free, rather do that. New American Standard. The being called in view is best taken to be the calling of an ancient slave into salvation and sanctification. Further specified as being called in the Lord. 1 Corinthians 7:22. A status of slavery in life has undoubtedly been assigned by God, 1 Corinthians 7:17, but it is a status for the ancient first century slave which should have been changed if the opportunity for freedom ever presented itself. A calling into salvation and sanctification, though, can be manifested in a position of slavery, given the likelihood that many first century believers in the Mediterranean basin who were also slaves may not have been given freedom. Paul further asserted, "For the one who was called in the Lord as a slave is the Lord's free man. Likewise, the one who was called while free is Messiah's slave." 1 Corinthians 7:22, Tree of Life version. A status in life, such as being a slave or being free, did not matter in terms of being called in the Lord. En kurio klethes, as both are spheres where people can represent him, and behavior which reflects their calling by him into redemption. Yet, there is a major difference between the free person who, when called into faith, may be regarded as the Messiah's slave, and the one who was called into faith while being a slave owned by some other mortal person, no matter how some of these verses may have been abused in history, i.e. 1 Corinthians 7:20, 24. The Apostle Paul was hardly one who opposed social mobility, and he was subversive to ancient first century norms when it came to the issue of slavery. He candidly stated, "You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of human masters." 1 Corinthians 7:23, New Revised Standard. The work of the good news or gospel in saving all people, slave or free, was something which was to work its way in society in people not owning other people, seeing the eventual abolishment of the practice. It is a sad shame that even in our 21st century world, forms of slavery still exist in much of the world. First Corinthians 7:24. Brothers, let each man, in whatever condition he was called, stay in that condition with God. World Messianic Bible. 1 Corinthians 7:24. The closing statement to what has been regarded as Paul's rule in all the assemblies closely mirrors that of what was asserted previously in 1 Corinthians 7:20, but there are some rendering issues. Here are a variety of contemporary English translations of 1 Corinthians 7:24 from the same versions quoted previously. So, brethren, in whatever state each was called, let him remain with God. Revised Standard Version. Brothers, each man as responsible to God should remain in the situation God called him to. New International Version. In whatever condition you were called, brothers and sisters, there remain with God. New Revised Standard. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God. English Standard Version. Brothers, each person should remain with God in whatever situation he was called. Holman Christian Standard Bible. Brethren, let every man wherein he is called therein abide with God. King James Version. Brethren, let each man wherein he was called therein abide with God. American Standard Version. 1 Corinthians 7:24 is a place where it is necessary to turn to the source text for the appropriate answer regarding what was being summarized. A version like the New American Standard notably has indicated added words in italics, which can escape the notice of readers who do not access English Bible versions with this feature. Brethren, each one is to remain with God in that condition in which he was called. New American Standard. Here, the value judgment of klesis for 1 Corinthians 7:20 representing condition, New American Standard, is repeated. Other versions, as listed above, do not make such an indication for English readers. Versions like the King James Version and American Standard Version, 1901, have wherein he is or was called with no additional words. The Brown and Comfort Greek Interlinear offers each one in what position in brackets he was called, brothers, and this let him remain with God. For hekastos en ho eklethe adelphoi en tuto meneto para theo. Here, the added word position has been placed in brackets. The assertion of 1 Corinthians 7:24 is similar, but not exactly the same to 1 Corinthians 7:20. Interpreters can be left wondering how to best render hekastos en ho eklethe, given the presence of the relative pronoun ho. F.F. Bruce indicates how this clause, quote, is literally each wherein he was called, unquote, further remarking, quote, the rendering state is more permissible here than in verse 20, unquote. Because of the presence of the relative pronoun ho, Bruce draws the conclusion that the calling or klesis of 1 Corinthians 7:20 can be extended a bit to incorporate one's life circumstances when called into redeeming faith. Quote, in this case, the sentence is very close to verse 20 with two modifications. Number one, the phrase in the calling is replaced by the relative pronoun in whatever. Two, the imperative is modified by the prepositional phrase with God. Both of these changes seem to verify our interpretation of verses 17 and 20 that simultaneously Paul is referring to one situation when called and to God's call, unquote. This conclusion is similar to those of other evangelical Protestant interpreters previously referenced, where God's calling people into faith manifests in one's life circumstances functioning as at least a semi-spiritual vocation. The issue regarding hekastos en ho eklethe, in that in which he was called, Young's literal translation, is actually more complicated than some may realize. Rather than the dative, that's the case indicating the indirect object, feminine noun kleise, excuse me, being repeated from 1 Corinthians 7:20. What appears instead is the dative, the case indicating the indirect object, neuter relative pronoun ho. In his textbook, Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics, Daniel B. Wallace describes how, quote, the relative pronoun agrees with its antecedent in gender and number, but its case is determined by the function it has in its own clause. Excuse me, unquote. Technically speaking, for 1 Corinthians 7:20 and 7:24, the feminine kleise should be followed by the feminine relative pronoun he. What appears instead is the neuter ho. Is this a problem? Wallace actually does detail how there are exceptions to the rule, stating, quote, not infrequently, relative pronouns do not follow the basic rules of agreement. Sometimes the gender of the relative pronoun does not match that of the antecedent, usually because of sense agreement superseding syntactical agreement, unquote. So it should not seem to be that big an issue for the neuter ho representing the feminine kleise. What this does for an interpreter is brings one back to the same challenge which had to be evaluated for 1 Corinthians 7:20. Was the calling / klesis in view a social, spiritual vocation or a calling to salvation and sanctification? Feasibly, modifying the New American Standard rendering, 1 Corinthians 7:24 could be translated with, brethren, each one is to remain with God in that calling in which he was called. Paul did conclude in 1 Corinthians 7:24 with, en tuto meneto para theo, therein abide with God, American Standard Version. Here, the answer we provided for 1 Corinthians 7:20 about abiding, the Greek verb meno, and the calling, representing one's calling into salvation and sanctification, is validated. A believer, having been called into Messiah faith, is to decisively abide with God in relationship and communion with him. All right, so now let's summarize what we've gone through. And again, if you need to go back and watch or listen to yesterday's live stream where we addressed 1 Corinthians 7:17 through 20, please do so. Or you can go right to Messianic Apologetics, the FAQ section, and then just read this all yourself. 1 Corinthians 7:17 through 24. Paul's rule in 1 Corinthians 7:17 through 24 was not that people are to remain stagnant and unchanged in a particular station in life that they perpetually occupy. Paul's rule was that people were to be abiding in the calling of God to salvation and holiness, who would then direct any changes to one's status as appropriate. The ancient slave, when presented the opportunity to become free, 1 Corinthians 7:21, was to surely take it. Likewise, how many other opportunities would be presented to ancient believers where they were called to Messiah faith in a particular life condition, such as being poor, oppressed, or in a nightmarish marriage relationship, who, as they prayed to God to fix things, would give them a way out. When an opportunity presented itself, were they not supposed to take it? We should not find a huge amount of problems with Leon Morris's view, quote, we should serve God where we are until he calls us elsewhere. Paul is not counseling an attitude of passive resignation and acceptance of the established order at all costs, unquote. The conclusions drawn in our examination of 1 Corinthians 7:17 through 24 are reflected in the following author's rendering, modified from the 1901 American Standard Version. Okay, so I've gone through these different verses. I've offered you some renderings, which are seen here or there in other versions, but are not too likely to be seen in some of the versions you have seen employed in a number of the Messianic examinations of this passage. So here we're going to modify the American Standard Version. Only as the Lord has assigned to each one, as God has called each, so let him walk. And so I direct in all the assemblies. Was anyone called being circumcised? Let him not practice episposm. Has anyone been called in foreskin? Let him not be circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and foreskin is nothing, but what matters is the keeping of the commandments of God. Let each one abide in the calling in which he was called. Were you called as a slave? Do not worry about it, but if you are able also to become free, rather use it. For he who was called in the Lord as a slave is the Lord's freed one. Likewise, he who was called while free is Messiah's slave. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of human beings. Brothers and sisters, let each one in that calling in which he was called in this abide with God. 1 Corinthians 7, 17 through 24, author's rendering. All right, so let's conclude this now with 1 Corinthians 7, 17 through 24, and today's Messianic movement. How are today's Messianic people to approach 1 Corinthians 7, 17 through 24? This passage has been too frequently avoided by laypersons who are widely unaware of the different translation and perspective issues relating to calling. They are being widely caught unaware by how various Messianic Jewish leaders, supportive of a bilateral ecclesiology, have been seen to apply 1 Corinthians 7, 17 through 24, in a way to make sure that Jewish and non-Jewish believers rigidly know what their differences are. Suffice it to say, even though things can already be complicated enough, with much resentment and suspicion among groups of people within the Messianic sphere of influence, there is likely to be ongoing and lamentable waves of it, substantially caused by those who fail to recognize that the calling described in 1 Corinthians 7, 17 through 24 is a calling to salvation and sanctification, and not a social/spiritual vocation. Those in positions of influence who are prone to espouse their position will not be too likely to engage that much with the source text and may instead argue almost exclusively from various English versions. Various Messianic Jewish interpreters will look at Paul's word of 1 Corinthians 7:18a. Was any man called when he was already circumcised? He is not to become uncircumcised. New American Standard. From the perspective that being circumcised, i.e. being Jewish, is a social/spiritual vocation which is not to be abandoned. A number of Messianic Jews have mainly used this, and understandably so, as a means to combat the tendency in far too much of past history that when Jewish people came to faith in Yeshua, they were to give up their Jewishness. Many Jewish believers of the past have assimilated away into Christianity, no longer circumcising their sons, remembering the Sabbath or appointed times, or eating kosher. Being enjoined with intermarriage, the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of such Jewish believers often have not had either an appreciation of or perhaps even knowledge of their Jewish heritage. It is absolutely appropriate for Jewish believers to oppose this sort of assimilation. But is 1 Corinthians 7:18a the place to base it from? Not if the calling in view is a calling to salvation and sanctification. Paul said elsewhere, for example, in Romans 3:1 and 2, then what advantage has the Jew, or what is the benefit of circumcision? Great in every respect. First of all, that they were entrusted with the oracles of God. New American Standard. As we have just argued, with a calling of God into salvation in view, for 1 Corinthians 7:18a, Paul opposed episposm as it would have decisively led to apostasy per the Maccabean crisis, 1 Maccabees 1, 10 through 15. A prohibition for Greek and Roman believers called into salvation to go through ritual proselyte circumcision did not mean an exception for Jewish believers to stop circumcising their sons. Paul's further assertion in 1 Corinthians 7, 18b, has anyone been called in uncircumcision? He is not to be circumcised, New American Standard, with uncircumcision, i.e. not being Jewish, taken to be a social/spiritual vocation, has been turned onto today's non-Jewish believers who have been led into Messianic congregations and have been moved by the Lord to consider a life of Torah obedience in emulation of Messiah Yeshua. Such a vocational calling to which non-Jewish believers are believed to be assigned by God does not really involve them ever keeping things like the seventh-day Sabbath, appointed times of Leviticus 23, or a kosher style of diet. And many non-Jewish believers in Messianic congregations probably need to return to a more standard church setting. If such things were ever to be observed, they are believed to only be important as a matter of living in solidarity with the Jewish people, but not as a matter of obedience compelled by God via the power of the new covenant. Jeremiah 31, 31 to 34, Ezekiel 36, 25 to 27. If Sabbath keeping or kosher eating were kept for a reason other than solidarity with the Jewish people, distinctions between Jews and non-Jews are believed to be blurred or erased. This understandably can get many non-Jewish Messianic believers greatly upset, especially when they are fully committed to being a part of the Messianic community, including living in solidarity with the Jewish people. It is as though living a Torah-obedient life does not have that much to do with their own spirituality or growth in the Lord. As we have just argued, with the calling of God into salvation in view, for 1 Corinthians 7:18b, Paul opposed non-Jewish believers being circumcised as proselytes because it would feed the idea that such circumcision was necessary for salvation. A common idea present in Second Temple Judaism was all Israelites have a share in the world to come. Mishnah Sanhedrin 10:1. Something resolved at the Jerusalem Council, Acts 15:1 and 5, with the decree that 4 prohibitions had to be followed by the new non-Jewish believers, Acts 15:19 through 21, 29, with Tanakh prophecy in the process of fulfillment, Acts 15:15 through 18. Such prophecy would have doubtlessly included the nations coming to Zion to be taught God's Torah, Micah 4:1 through 3, Isaiah 2:2 through 4, and when followed, the apostolic decree would sever the Greek and Roman believers from their old pagan spheres of influence and see them attached to a community where Moses was being taught every week, Acts 15:21. The promised new covenant was to see God's instruction supernaturally transcribed onto the hearts and minds of his people, Jeremiah 31, 31 to 34, Ezekiel 36, 25 to 27, not forced onto people via the demands of mortals. On the contrary, all are to abide in the calling into salvation, 1 Corinthians 7:20, 24, and allow God to direct them according to his sovereign will. And in the last days, to be certain, people from the nations are to decisively join with the Jewish people as one composite people of God, Zechariah 8:23. Romans 11:29 makes it quite clear that God has placed a special vocational calling onto the Jewish people. For the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, New American Standard. This is an eternal distinction which can never be revoked from them, even with all Messiah followers being a part of a kingdom of priests and a holy nation as well, 1 Peter 2:9 and 10. But the calling being described in 1 Corinthians 7, 17 through 24 is a calling into salvation and sanctification by God, and is directly affected by passages like 1 Corinthians 1, 9, 26, and Ephesians 4, 1 through 6. This is something which has not been taken as seriously as it should be by enough of today's Messianic Jewish leaders. If, as we have proposed, let each one abide in the calling in which he was called, 1 Corinthians 7:20, author's rendering, is the appropriate way to approach Paul's rule in all the assemblies, what would it mean for ancient Jewish believers to have abided in their calling to salvation and sanctification? Presumably, it would mean a greater manifestation of God's grace and wisdom, as seen in the Tanakh, demonstrated toward others, a better understanding of such believers' Jewish heritage and how it could be used to educate and enrich others, and most importantly, a better appreciation for God's sovereign direction of Israel through the centuries and his plans for restoring the kingdom. To go through episposm, 1 Corinthians 7:18a, would be throwing this and many more things on the proverbial garbage heap. What would it mean for an ancient Greek and Roman believer to abide in the calling in which he was called? Presumably, it would be manifested in a better understanding of their salvation via Israel's Messiah as those from the nations, a better understanding of and commitment to studying Israel's scriptures, a further probing of God's plan for bringing knowledge of himself to the world, and how Jewish and non-Jewish believers together can enlarge such a mission, a better understanding of and commitment to obedience to the commandments of God via his Holy Spirit, and a participation in the restoration of his kingdom on earth, which would culminate in the Messiah's return. Being circumcised as a proselyte was entirely incompatible as a precondition of being called into salvation per ancient Jewish issues with it, Mishnah Sanhedrin 10:1. Being circumcised in conjunction with future eschatological realities would not have been too likely for the first century Greek and Roman believers, Ezekiel 44:9, but it can be honored today by non-Jewish believers in the Messianic world, where circumcision is decisively not a salvation issue and is a common medical practice. Because of religious politics and entangling alliances and the groupthink mentality being what they are for much of the Messianic community, one should not expect 1 Corinthians 7, 17 through 24 to be approached from the perspective of a calling into salvation and sanctification by too many Messianic Jewish teachers and leaders in the short term. On the contrary, one might even expect some of the most rigid social/spiritual vocational calling perspectives possible to manifest, and with that, a retreading of the old, tired, complementarian line that we are all equal in salvation, but different in roles. While we should not be led to naively think that each one of us is exactly the same, as natural distinctions among people will always exist, and equal in salvation, different in roles perspective has been used in the past to justify slavery or permit bad things to happen to people, falsely believing that a person's station in life was or is a divine vocation which cannot ever change or be altered. It has been most recently used in a great deal of evangelical Protestantism to deter women from pursuing religious educational opportunities and leadership positions in the body of Messiah. While today's Messianic Jewish leaders who have a social/spiritual vocation in view of 1 Corinthians 7, 17 through 24, are not trying to validate slavery or support a denigration of women. Their incorrect interpretation can only deter or delay much of the work of God, which is manifesting in stark reality on the ground in many of their own congregations, i.e. Zechariah 8:23. And no one should ever want to be found actually impeding salvation history. Those who hold to 1 Corinthians 7, 17 through 24, speaking to a calling by God into salvation and sanctification, have a definite responsibility to demonstrate faith working through love, Galatians 5, 6, and what it means to be a new creation, Galatians 6:15, to those with whom we might theologically disagree. While many of our acknowledged Messianic leaders might not get it at present, many individual Messianic people most certainly will. And once again, I encourage you to go back to the Messianic Apologetics website, look at the FAQ section. You can click there and you can download the whole PDF version of this analysis, because it is technical. It gets into some clauses, some definitions many of you are familiar with. But if anything, I hope some of you all are aware that you have likely been influenced by some approaches to 1 Corinthians 7, 17 through 24, which do not take into account what other examiners have said. They probably have not taken into account, is this a calling as a social or spiritual vocation, or a divine summons to salvation and sanctification? And then number three, they probably have not taken into account how remain in the station to which you were assigned, basically, has been abused in history to justify the ongoing retention of the institution of slavery, to keep people in bad situations. It's been used to support the oppression of women and a whole lot of other bad things. So this won't be the last time we address this passage, but I hope that I've given you enough to think about. And the next time you see Paul's rule and it's stay in your place, basically, you can pause and say, now, wait a second. While Jewish and non-Jewish believers have their differences, Jewish believers are not supposed to give up their Jewish heritage. And in the case of 1 Corinthians 7, commit episposm, commit apostasy, assimilate. Non-Jewish believers in 1 Corinthians 7, they were not to be circumcised as proselytes to Judaism and accept a salvation by ethnicity premise when we're called into salvation with God by his grace and we're saved by his grace. While we have our differences, okay, we're not all exactly the same. That is a huge mistake of one law, one Torah theology, a lot of what you see in Hebrew roots. We do have to see the pendulum shift back toward focusing on common faith first, partnering together, co-laboring in the salvation of Israel. And unfortunately, for many years, we have been led by people who are very insecure when that is something entirely biblical brought forth. How do we focus on common faith first? Now, tomorrow, to kind of continue what we've discussed and to clarify some things possibly, we're going to be going through our ministry's FAQ on circumcision, all right? Because quite frequently, when you see circumcision discussed in the New Testament, it's not so much a medical operation, it's ritual proselyte conversion. It's not the medical procedure which, you know, many men, myself included, have partaken of for the past century and a half in the West. That's something a little different. But this is something which we do, I suspect, need to talk about as we've just discussed Paul's rule. All right, so that concludes our theology roundup. Let's move on to our news roundup. Now, we do the news roundup after the theology roundup because the news is, of course, time sensitive and it changes from day to day. But we definitely need to be aware of things going on. We don't need to be in a bubble. Number one, we need to be praying for peace. Israel, Gaza, the Middle East. We got some developments today to talk about. Number two, we need to be praying for peace. Russia and Ukraine. Not so much to talk about today. And then number three, we got to be praying for reason and sanity to prevail here on the American home front, especially as things like Russiagate, Epstein, We're going to probably have things on the Biden auto pen, whatever it is, as they are brought up and discussed. So all of the links I'm about to go through, these are things which will be available for you to look at later today, read the articles, watch the different clips when this episode is archived at messianicapologetics.net. All right, our first story. This is from Open Source Intel Defender, yesterday, November the 17th, 2:30 p.m. There's a 30-second clip. U.S. President Donald J. Trump tells reporters earlier in the Oval Office that the United States will sell F-35A Lightning IIs to Saudi Arabia, despite continued concerns of Chinese espionage raised by the Defense Intelligence Agency, DIA, and other sectors of the Pentagon. Okay, so... And by the way, before going live, I did see some more on that. It does appear that the sale of F-35s to Saudi Arabia is going to go through. The real question is, are they going to be the same F-35s that the Israeli Air Force has, or they're going to be, not as advanced? All right. Also from Open Source Intel Defender, November 17th, 2:46 p.m. And there's a 1-minute, 2-second clip. Speaking earlier in the Oval Office, President Donald J. Trump tells reporters that he would sign, not veto, a bill directing the Justice Department to release all files related to the case against convicted sex offender and trafficker Jeffrey Epstein if it passes a vote in the House and the Senate. All right, so this is something, of course, many of us have been waiting on for quite a while. We've seen President Trump say various trolling remarks that the Epstein list, this is a Democratic hoax. We've seen others say, what are you afraid of, Mr. President? Are you in the Epstein files? I mean, we've seen this go back and forth, but now there's this growing momentum on both the right as well as the left to see the Epstein files released. And the only good I know this is going to come from it is we're going to see how bad some of our political leaders, different industry leaders, entertainers, sports figures, whomever they are, we're going to see how bad some of these people are. And already we're going to mention what happened with Larry Summers in just a few moments. But people's trust in society is going to drop. And hopefully, whatever comes of it, it will draw many people to the Lord and many people to his word. Okay, speaking of the Middle East, here we got Open Source Intel Defender. This is yesterday at 4:20 p.m. The UN Security Council has voted 13-0, with both China and Russia abstaining, in favor of adopting a resolution authorizing the creation of a board of peace and an international stabilization force in the Gaza Strip, as outlined in U.S. President Donald J. Trump's comprehensive plan to end the Gaza conflict. So we know that President Trump's plan to see peace in the Middle East, peace in Gaza, it's moving forward. And we know whether it's going to be Israel, the Palestinians, other local Arab Islamic powers, they're going to be things they like, they're going to be things they don't like, and they're going to be some starts and stops. And of course, the big question a lot of people have is this something which is laying the groundwork for the Daniel 9:27, and I'll say it this way, scenario? Because there are people who think that the anti-Messiah or Antichrist formally signs an agreement or a covenant with Israel. But depending on how you look at the verb gavar, it can be translated as make a firm, New American Standard, or confirm, King James Version. So another scenario is that the beast will come along and he will give his assent to an already existing treaty and then probably build upon it and what have you. That's why I would say, is the Trump peace plan laying the groundwork for the Daniel 9:27 scenario? We have to wait. From the White House, and this is, of course, resending a Truth Social post from President Donald Trump. United Nations Security Council acknowledges and endorses President Trump's Board of Peace. And look at all the countries, of course, which we'll say participated in the UN vote. That's pretty significant. Also from the White House, and I thought this was very important to pass along. Excuse me. There we go. This is from yesterday at 7:42 p.m., so yesterday evening. From the Golden Arches to America's Golden Age, POTUS speaks at the McDonald's Summit. I had no idea there was a McDonald's Summit. But here, my pledge to every family and every small business is that I will not rest until you are richer, stronger, more successful, happier, until you've gotten a piece of the American dream. So here, you can't get much more, Main Street than going to a McDonald's Summit. But the stress of the president officially, as it involves America's golden age, is to help the little guy, help small families, small businesses, partake of the American dream, return America to some degree of prosperity, bringing back industry, cutting taxes, hopefully paying off the national debt. Is the president going to be successful? I have no idea. But we all, even if we're not Americans, are going to be affected by this in some way. Okay, here's something very important to pass on per the situation in Mexico. This is from yesterday afternoon, 2:34, so this would have been after we finished up. I found it. Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum is pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel socialist, as far from her Jewish roots as one can be. Yet, when riots erupt, the graffiti calls her puta judía, Jewish whore. You can run from your Jewish roots, but anti-Semites will always remind you. Indeed, there are a lot of Jewish people out there in the world. History bears witness to this. When persecution comes against the Jewish community, they try to side with the prevailing social trend, prevailing power, and it doesn't work. Even people who, they try to hide their Jewishness. Well, I'm only half Jewish. I'm only a quarter Jewish. People find a way to discover that, and they come after you. And indeed, we, of course, totally condemn the graffiti you see in Mexico City there against President Sheinbaum. But the world is barreling toward a situation where everyone is going to come against Israel and the Jewish people. And right now, guess what they need more than anything else? They need all the friends and allies they can get. With that in mind, here's a very interesting post that came across my feed on Instagram. Yes, it's from Jonathan Cahn, but here he talks about, you can watch this in its entirety later, a mystery in the words synagogue, church, Israelite, and Israeli, and how the modern rebirth of Israel and the Israelis opens up a revelation for every believer. How you are actually a spiritual Israeli. Now, you might disagree with some of the methodology of Jonathan Cahn, but his overall point, and of course, we do know from the New Testament that non-Jewish believers are fellow citizens with the saints. They are co-heirs with their fellow Jewish believers in the Commonwealth of Israel. They're citizens of the Commonwealth of Israel. Okay. That doesn't mean they're all exactly the same, but we are to focus on common elements of faith and our shared work for the kingdom first. But one of the things that Jonathan Cahn goes into, and appropriately so, he says that, when a lot of people read the Tanakh, the Old Testament, they see the term Israelite. In English, that is a useful differentiation from modern Israel, modern Israelis. Okay, so when we talk about the ancient Israelites, we're talking about the people who were led out of Egypt, led through the wilderness, led into the promised land, and built the kingdom, right? Well, in Hebrew, of course, there's no difference between Israeli, either speaking of the ancient Israelites or modern Israelis. And he brought that up to point out that, non-Jewish believers have a shared spiritual heritage in what goes on not only in the Bible, but even what is happening today. And it was his conclusion that non-Jewish believers are spiritual Israelis. And I think what's important to keep in mind with Jonathan Cahn is he can say to mainly non-Jewish people who follow him that you're a spiritual Israeli, and I don't consider that to be replacement theology, because what he's looking for, as the Messianic Jewish community should be, are non-Jewish people who are joining with them in common cause, standing against this wave of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and most especially co-laboring with them in the Acts 1:6, Lord, is it at this time you're restoring the kingdom to Israel, purpose for why this movement is here. So I thought that was a very important thing to pass along. Okay, here on the American home front, I already mentioned Larry Summers. This is from Breitbart today, November the 18th, from Instagram. Ex-Harvard president, Clinton Treasury Secretary Larry Summers, deeply ashamed of Epstein relationship, will step back from public life. Democrat backfire. This is what Breitbart says. Former Harvard president Larry Summers, who also served as Treasury Secretary under President Bill Clinton, is stepping away from public life after emails revealed a long-term relationship with convicted sex criminal Jeffrey Epstein. So Larry Summers is very embarrassed. He's shamed about his relationship with Epstein. He's just going to pull away from public life. And I would think that with whatever comes out regarding the Epstein files, that's what you're going to see more than anything else. You're going to see different people who they were on a plane or they went to Epstein Island. They may not have gotten involved in something really bad, but they are ashamed that they took favors from the guy, and they're just going to have to pull away from public life, and they're just going to have to suck up with the stigma of having been involved with him. You know. All right, so our next story, we only have 4 more to go. Okay, this is kind of interesting for Gog and Magog people. This is from this morning, November the 18th, 8:58 a.m. According to the Israeli Broadcasting Corporation, Moscow and Damascus have reached an understanding to return Russian peacekeepers to the Syrian-Israeli frontier. The forces had previously pulled out from their observation posts following the collapse of the Assad government. Right. And look, whether you believe that the Gog-Magog conflict, Ezekiel 38-39, is a Russian-Arab alliance or not, this does indicate that, look, the Middle East is in Russia's backyard. What happens in the Middle East concerns Russia. So that's what this is about. And what it means is that if there's a conflict in the Middle East, Russia is going to easily get pulled into it. We wait and, of course, see, but I know this is going to get a lot of the Gog-Magog people going and talking and concluding things. All right, some of you all may have encountered this morning. I encountered it in part. This at Grod 24, 6:35 a.m. A global Cloudflare outage has disrupted multiple social networks and major online services. Scrolling down, due to the outage, platforms such as X, Spotify, ChatGPT, and several other major services experienced disruptions. Down Detector, the website that tracks service outages, was also affected. Okay, so yeah, around 6:30 in the morning, I was looking at X, and I noticed that a number of videos, a number of things which tend to be active on X, they weren't loading. X was loading, but that's about all I encountered. But yeah, over the past year, we've encountered a number of these kinds of outages. One of the biggest outages took place in the summer. It was Google Cloud, which our streaming service used. So we had to delay our Messianic Insider until later in the afternoon when StreamYard was back up again. But yeah, these things happen. Of course, people are going to say, was it hacked? Was there a power outage? Did somebody clip the wrong cable? There could be all kinds of explanations, but it seems that a lot of things are back and up and running. Okay, this is, of course, very important. We know that the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, he is in Washington right now. before we got started, there was still the press conference in the Oval Office taking place. But here, this is from this morning, 11:08 a.m. U.S. President Donald J. Trump and Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman stand side by side in front of the South Portico as a formation of F-35A Lightning IIs and F-15E Strike Eagles fly over the White House. So there you have it. And that kind of a picture pretty much confirms that Saudi Arabia is going to be getting the F-35. Yes, and I think yesterday I said that the F-35 was manufactured. It is manufactured out near Fort Worth, but I said General Dynamics. I meant Lockheed Martin. Okay, and our last story, and this pertains to the state of Texas. Libs of TikTok. This was posted on posted today, 10:12 a.m. Breaking: Governor Greg Abbott designated the Muslim Brotherhood and Council on American Islamic Relations, CAIR, as foreign terrorist organizations. So, yeah, the state of Texas, these are foreign terrorist organizations. And one of the things many people have been noticing is that the number of mosques, the Islamic population of the state of Texas, has been increasing. And why is that the case? Is it just because there are some high-tech jobs in the state of Texas? We also have a growing Hindu population. Or is it because the Islamicists are looking at a state of Texas, a huge bastion of conservatism in the continental United States, and if it can go blue, then their agenda for America takes some huge steps forward. So we'll see what the response is to what Governor Abbott has done. With each action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, right? Newton taught us that. So we'll just wait and see. All right, and so that concludes our news roundup for today. And as I said, tomorrow on the Theology Roundup, we'll be going through the frequently asked question entry on circumcision, in case some of you are wondering, well, John, where do you stand regarding circumcision? Because you interpret 1 Corinthians 7 from some kind of an ancient position. Non-Jews weren't to be circumcised, meaning go through proselyte conversion. But what about today? And what does that mean? So we're going to discuss that. And you, of course, can go to Messianic Apologetics. You can already access that information. It's been up on the site for 3 years almost. All right. As always, on behalf of Messianic Apologetics, Outreach Israel Ministries, I would like to thank you for your ongoing prayers, encouragement, and support for all of our ministry efforts. If you have not, please do visit my website, messianicapologetics.net. There you can access a wide array of free articles, frequently asked questions entries. You can take a look at some back issues of Outreach Israel News. You can take a look at some back episodes of Messianic Insider, different McKee moment shorts, etc. And please do give a thumbs up to this episode on the different social media platforms. Heart it, as it will help it have greater exposure on social media. We'll see you again tomorrow with another episode of Messianic Insider. Until then, may God bless you. Shalom, and take care.